Well, a happy Babylon New Year. It is Sunday, January 4, 2026.
And little babies cry.
It's the Africa Forum. Thank you for joining us on the 107s, 107.1, all the way to 107.9. Thank you for joining us on the internet at iriafm.net, on your mobile apps. However you're listening to us this morning, Flow Channel 822, Digiplay at 17 minutes after 6 o'clock. A very rainy day on the island. It's been raining for a few days now on this side of the world. Jamaica's been seeing a lot of rain, so we've been having rains in St. Anne, St. Mary, Portland, St. Thomas, and in some cases, serious flooding. So for those who have been flooded out right on the backside of a Hurricane Melissa, we're not even over that yet, and we're flooding out already. So we know that this is a period of great challenges for a lot of us. So we see the flooding in St. Thomas, the heavy flooding in St. Mary. Not quite sure what's happening in your neck of the woods in Jamaica, but it's raining. Oh, and we heard that there lots of rain in parts of Kingston this morning too. So take it easy on the roads. It's wet. It is soaked. We've been having really heavy rains. So where it looks like it's okay, it probably isn't. Look out for landslides too. So that's what we are dealing with on the island. How are things with you where you are? Thank you for joining us on the 7 continents. Welcome to the Africa Forum, Running African, AFRA, AFRA, Africa Forum, Running African. We're going with it. We've been using it for years, actually. AFRA, yeah. Our vision is to reunite the African family for development. Our mission includes blazing new paths towards Africa's rendezvous with destiny, bearing witness, demanding change, crafting an African-centered agenda for change and development, all the while honoring my moral obligation to remember. Well, it's a brand new year, 2026. It's year 1 if you're working with this calendar over this side. If you're working with Ethiopia, you know we're pushing 2018. We are 4 years, the last 4 years of the global reset. Agenda 2030. So nothing surprises us. Everything is on track. It is as they said it would be. What they say and what they said that they would do, they are doing. What they've got to do to survive, they are doing. De-dollarization, transhumanism, technocracy. It is as they said. Nothing is surprising us right now. Yesterday morning, right here in the Caribbean waters, we witnessed and bore witness to what many would see as the unthinkable, the eruption and rebirth and spawning of the spirit of the buccaneer. This is no surprise. We're not surprised. As I said before, you amass the largest armada anywhere in the world since the Iraq War. What was the reason for it? Were you just going to pack up and turn tail and run? So this we knew. There's no surprises here. We were certain that, Venezuela would be attacked on whatever pretext. But we have been discussing for the last 7 months why the Caribbean waters, why Venezuela would be attacked, and why the pretext would be a lie. For the last 2 years, we've been looking at, a year and a half, we've been looking at narco trafficking. It's probably 2 years, narco trafficking in the region as a precursor. And that's what it turned out to be, because we didn't even know that it would have been a precursor. But it turned out to be a precursor to where we are now. And so that gives us a much better understanding of why the pretext for the attack on Venezuela is all a lie. So yes, this morning we have cancelled quite a few segments, and they are preempted actually by the ongoing geopolitical crisis in the Caribbean waters. Interestingly enough, there's one segment that we didn't need to cancel because this was a plan to look at the geopolitical issues affecting the Caribbean, CARICOM, and specifically within the context of the Armada, the U.S. Armada in the Caribbean waters. So we didn't need to preempt or cancel that. So that's still on. In about 5 minutes, we're going to start the discussion. So one of the things that we've done, we've reached out to quite a few of experts who have been on over time. We managed to get one or two confirmations for this morning. We're still awaiting others. If they come in while we're on air, then we'll bring them in. But in the meantime, to say that we're going to be looking at the crisis, if you will, in the Caribbean waters right now. And so in a few moments, we'll be talking to our first guest about that. And then later on, as the morning goes on, we're also going to be looking at, Africa is in the center of a geopolitical chessboard, a geopolitical storm, if you will, the continent of Africa. So one of the interviews we didn't have to preempt either or cancel. This was planned and we'll go on this morning. It's a discussion on just looking at the continent of Africa, where the geopolitical hotspots are, and then to spend a few moments looking at the Horn of Africa as it relates to the announcement by Israel that it will recognize Somaliland, but also that whole upheaval, if you will, in the waters of both the Horn of Africa and the so-called Middle East. Last week we told you to get your maps and so on, look at what's happening there. Also Ethiopia on the sidelines. Ethiopia is in the midst of this storm and will have to make a decision shortly. I don't think Ethiopia has the luxury of time. Egypt has entered the fray, angry as ever. But there's just so much happening as we enter 2026, that we have to pay attention to. We should be paying attention to. The bottom line is that everything is connected. It is all connected. None of this is in isolation. What's happening in the Caribbean waters is connected to what's happening in the Red Sea waters of the Horn of Africa. It's all connected. So we have quite a bit to get through this morning and for the month of January into February and March, because things are only going to get more heated, worse, if you will, depending on the lens you're wearing. But a lot of us expect what's happening now. So this is not a worse or better for us. It is, what about us? How do we survive this? What is our responsibility? What should we be doing in this time of crisis? But this is a crisis it didn't start last week, and that is the bottom line. This has been going on for a while. Remember, on the backside, the lockdown during COVID signaled everything that's happening now. So it was pretty clear that we came out of that lockdown into the global reset on steroids. So whether you look at it as a de-dollarization and the fight for the dollar and the struggle for survival, it depends, however you want to name the symptoms of what's happening. The reality is that we can't be bystanders just commentating. We have to be sure about our own survival in the midst of it and the extent to which we are already sold. That's another thing because, what is the German word for leader? Because that's another question. Because I notice here in Jamaica now, every politician, there's a new wave. It's a new idea, I know. But if you notice that whether you're PNP or you're JLP, that the leader is called leader, they are called leader. So by especially those who are in the synagogue of Satan, those in parliament, and those who are close to the center of the party or the engine room, if you will. They call the head of the party, the leader of the party. They call the leader. Leader, yeah. And so I've been thinking about what's the German word for leader. Anybody know? All right, we're standing by to speak with my very special guest, our first guest, Akamototo, Brother Akamototo, born in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, involved in the revolutionary movement there in what some refer to as the Black Power movement. He was a senior member of the NJAC, the National Joint Action Committee of Trinidad and Tobago. And he has also been involved in the book and publishing industries in the U.S., in Chicago and Atlanta for over 20 years. He's a founder of the Rio Claro Heritage and Preservation Organization, an organization based in rural South Trinidad. He's also the founding member of the Caribbean Progressive Perspectives. He was one of our keynote speakers here last year, August, for our celebration of Mwalimu and our tribute to Mwalimu Marcus Messiah Garvey. Brother Ako Mutota joins me on the phone lines. Brother Ako, thank you so much for joining us so early inside of the Africa Forum this morning.
Good morning, Sister Kabu. Thanks for the opportunity to be your guest on your show this morning. I think it's the first show of 2026.
It is the very first show of 2026, and you are my very first guest of 2026.
So I am very honored. Thank you, yes, and good morning to our listening audience, and a happy New Year to everyone, and hope that the New Year brings betterment and all that people wish.
And to you too. Themselves. And to you too, Brother Ako. Interestingly enough, just so our listeners know, you were scheduled to speak on this program before the events of Saturday of January 3, and we were scheduled to have a discussion on the geopolitical issues in the Caribbean and also relating to what was unfolding regarding CARICOM, what was unfolding regarding Venezuela, the Caribbean waters, and so on. So that was our plan anyway, to have this discussion, and this was confirmed between us before this event. And so we didn't have to preempt it or cancel, which is what I was just explaining to the listeners, that we had to cancel quite a few conversations. But this was already planned. I want to start, Brother Ako, by just getting before we go into the other issues, your immediate response to what has transpired, the military action in the early hours of January 3, just yesterday, that the United States launched the attack on multiple sites in Venezuela, including Caracas. After 2 o'clock, a lot of us were up just, watching that unfold. What do you make of this?
Sister Kabu, I have been speaking with people over the weekend since this incident happened in Venezuela, and I've been frequently quoting the Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci. And the quote that I've been using is a quote Gramsci made, during the period of the Second World War. And he said, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Mm-hmm. It is a time of monsters. Mm-hmm. And I think that this quote, explains to some extent what is happening in the world.
Yes.
That we are witnessing the collapse of U.S. imperialism and Western hegemony. A process that began with the Columbus expedition over 500 years ago. Mm-hmm. And if we are to learn from history, we are seeing the repeat of if you want to call it this, the actions coming full circle again with an event in the Western Hemisphere where the Columbus expedition began with the enslavement and decimation of our peoples. Mm-hmm. And so here again, 500 years later, we are seeing history repeat itself with the invasion of Venezuela, the attacks on Venezuela, and the kidnapping of its president. Mm-hmm. This is what imperialism has done throughout its existence. Kidnap people, attack them, and so this is nothing new. Now, for us and for a generation, mm-hmm. It may appear to be a moment of despair because, make no mistake about it, imperialism has struck a blow in our hemisphere.
Yes.
But I will quote our ancestor Amilcar Cabral on this.
Yes.
He said, we must claim no easy victory and tell no lies. It is a blow that has been struck. Mm-hmm. But in moments like these, we must return to our ancestors, to our prophets, to be guided by their words. And another person who, is appropriate for this moment again is the legendary Jose Marti, the liberator of South America, and who was born in Venezuela.
Yes.
And who, the quote said, it seems that the United States is destined by providence to plague our America with misery in the name of liberty. I mean, this is what Marty said 196 years ago. And the United States appear to be destined by providence to plague our America with misery in the name of liberty. And today, what does the U.S. do? It's plaguing our hemisphere, right, with misery in the name of democracy, fighting narco-terrorism and so on. But this is imperialism repeating its ugly face again, showing its ugly face. And one last quote again from Thomas Sankara. He said that imperialism is a bad student. It never learns. It repeats the same mistakes over and over. And so what we are witnessing is imperialism and Western hegemony as it is collapsing, and we know that the death of a collapsing horse can give it the worst kick ever. So while it is a moment of temporary despair, we must learn from history that this empire is in fact falling apart. That is why it has to show its brazen and naked face in terms of what it did in Venezuela.
And I want you to build out on that for us, Brother Akko, in terms of, because we're listening intently, we hear the premise, which is, here we have an empire that is disintegrating, and this is a fight on their part, or its part, for survival, an eagle whose wings have been clipped. Build out on this, develop on that for us, so our listeners understand the point that is being made. That, one, this is nothing new, you've said. Secondly, here we have the death, if you will, or a dying United States of America that's making last-ditch efforts for survival, hence the attack in the Caribbean waters.
It is not just the United States, it is the entire project of Western hegemony and imperialism.
Yes.
The United States is the inheritor of the whole Eurocentric so-called conquest of the world.
Yes.
And so the United States is the inheritor of that process from the British, who was the last possibly so-called great European empire. And with the rise in consciousness of our people across the world and oppressed peoples across the world, the contradictions of this so-called civilization is showing its head, and people are seeing what it is, and so people are responding. So the attack on Venezuela is not just an attack on Venezuela. It's the attack of an idea, what they consider a bad example, because they do not want to see an example set that defies their logic. And their logic is the logic of the extermination of peoples, of settler colonialism, where if they want something, they take it. In fact, I think it was Rumsfeld, the late evil Secretary of Defense, said, and to quote him, I don't remember the exact quote, but it sounded like this. He doesn't know why God placed America's resources under other people's land. That's how they see it.
Yeah.
In other words, our resources, our beaches, our oil and gas, Venezuela's oil or gold, it so happens to be in Venezuela's land, but it belongs to the U.S. And that is the logic of the cowboy, the logic of the exterminator of the indigenous peoples. And that is the logic. And this is no different. And people have to understand this, right? I've heard sometimes loose comments about Chinese colonization in the Caribbean. Yes, the Chinese have been engaged in some exploitative practice relative to business. But you cannot compare that to what colonization is. What happened in Venezuela is the logic of the colonizer. That they want something from you and they will take it from you, even if it means your death or your extermination. And this is why Israel is so important as a settler colony, because the United States is a settler colony. It exterminated the indigenous people, right? It wanted their land and their resources and exterminated them. And this is the logic that is driving this. It is the logic of capitalism and imperialism. And we must be very clear on that.
And you mentioned Thomas Sankara just now. If Thomas Sankara could be eliminated for asserting economic sovereignty, what message is being sent today to the Caribbean in particular, since this is the context of our conversation, that if you dare to resist U.S. financial and political domination, you know, what the outcome for you will be? What do you think the message is that is being sent to the rest of the Caribbean?
The Caribbean leadership, as distinct from the Caribbean people, you know, C.L.R. James said that the West Indian people are the most rebellious in history. And if you look at our history, you would see where we have always rebelled against oppression throughout our history. And some subtle, some not so subtle, some overt and some covert. So we have always rebelled. What has happened is that we have, in the course of our recent history, imposed a class of leadership, which I call a kakistocratic class, a kakistocracy. And kakistocracy means governance by the least capable people, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I have used this term quite frequently because it is not a democracy we have, it's a kakistocracy.
Yes.
Our business elites, our intellectual elites, our political elites are incompetent people, are people who are willing to be subservient, right, to foreign powers. You know, they have no interest in national sovereignty. They do not even understand, our recent history. This is why our shameless and shameful Prime Minister, right, could make the statements she made about the Venezuela situation, just totally towing the line of the U.S. And not only that, we had our first senior president who was in office, I think, before this president. Mm-hmm. When asked who her heroes were, she said it was Winston Churchill and Eugenia Charles. Churchill, a racist who killed over 20 million people in India with his policies, and Eugenia Charles a sellout. But my point to people is this: it is not the individuals, whether it's a Brong in Antigua. It is our institutions that are creating these people. Mm-hmm. You know, our institutions, our educational institutions, our social institutions are producing these people that will steal Usain Bolt's money. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. In the same breath that they will do that, they will sell out our sovereignty, sell out our independence. I'll give you a classic case. There is a report that just came out on Guyana. And it's the oil, the thing with Exxon, in which they were doing the profit and loss.
Yes,
and
yes.
Exxon made out of Ghana's $8 billion. They got $8 billion plus ConocoPhillips got some 500 and some million. I have the report, and it's called Ghana's oil profits. But the Ghana government got 2.5 billion. So they have sold out the people of Guyana. That is what the U.S. want.
And on the back of the invasion and the attack on Venezuela, Exxon's stocks have gone up like gone to the roof because of the anticipation of what they are about to do also in Venezuela. So that the Caribbean finds itself in an interesting position right now, individual Caribbean countries and collectively. I know that both of us we've had the discussion already about CARICOM. You've also said the leaders are different from the people. So I want you to make that differentiation and then to say, are we witnessing the demise or not of CARICOM on the back of this?
You know, CARICOM, to a large extent, Sister Kabu, has been a fictitious entity. You know, there is a book a guy wrote some years ago about states as imagined entities. Yes. Said states are imagined entities. They have a flag and an anthem, and you sell an idea of what the state is. But essentially, the state is an imagined entity that people buy into, and with certain laws and all that kind of stuff. So CARICOM, to some extent, is an imagined entity, but it has also been very fictitious in the sense that it has never really taken on legs in terms of implementing any practical solutions or any, if you want to call it, infrastructural solutions to solving Caribbean people's problems. It's a issue I raised on a couple of your shows before.
Yes.
That in the colonial days, we had ships, the Federal Palm and the Federal Maple, that left Trinidad and went straight up to Jamaica, and people traveled back and forth between the Caribbean, carrying goods and services. So even with something like that, CARICOM could not even implement something that existed in the colonial time. Now, does it have some value? Yes, it does, because it is the one thing that possibly can bring our people together, and we should be together because we are small, relatively speaking, in numbers compared to other countries in the world. And we know that in our unity, we can do mighty things. Let's look at what the West Indies cricket team has done. I mean, we have beaten people in cricket, countries like India, which is a few thousand times as our population, Australia and the British for more than 10 years. So it shows that in our unity, if we pull our resources together, what is possible. So yes, CARICOM is important. But it is important in the sense that it must take legs with an ideological formation that serves the people. Cabral made an important statement relative to that too, about the people. And he said that the people are not fighting for ideas. They are fighting for material survival. They are fighting to guarantee their future. They are fighting to see that their children live healthy and happy lives. They want to move forward into the future. Cabral said this in the speech. So always bear in mind, the people are not fighting for ideas. They are fighting to win material benefits, to live better. And so CARICOM has not provided an idea or a solution. How can it make Caribbean people live better? These leaders have destroyed our legacy economies in food production and other things, and have replaced it throughout the Caribbean with tourism, what people call the new plantations. So the same product in Jamaica, in Antigua, in St. Lucia, in Barbados, dependable on the whim and fancy of Europeans or North Americans. And so this is the model of economic development that CARICOM has given us and have propagated under the guise of so-called democracy, which is another idea that is questionable.
The extent to which CARICOM is really the policies coming out of CARICOM, including the tourism debacle, the extent to which this is happening and this is so entrenched across the Caribbean, to what extent is that directly related to how the elites are the ones driving this? Those who control the hotels and the tourism industry and offshoots of that, and not so much, and not decisions being made by the politicians.
The elites are certainly driving this. The elites, the economic elite in the Caribbean has always been a parasitic class. Okay? There's always been a parasitic class. And so they are creating these these cartels and these monopolies, which incidentally I've been reading Lenin recently, and that's what Lenin's been talking about. Capitalism reaches a state where it creates cartels and these family monopolies. And if you look at Trinidad, for example, and I know to some extent in Jamaica, you will see where there are certain families who dominate critical sectors of the economy.
To a large extent in Jamaica.
Exactly.
Yes.
And it's happening in Trinidad. And so this is part of the imperialistic phase where the local oligarchs, the families and these organize these cartels. And so this is a logical phase. This is why when we speak about class struggle, nobody wants to hear that in the Caribbean. But we have to understand things in the context of class. Now, we have tended at times to focus a lot on identity politics, which is important. Don't get me wrong.
Yes.
Part of our struggle as people of African descent and East Indian descent is the assault that colonialism placed on our psyche by distorting our vision of who we are as Africans and other non-European people. So that is an important thing.
Yes.
But we cannot lose sense of what the primary contradiction is, or the primary focus, which is the issue of class in the Caribbean.
Yes.
You know, we have this false concept in Trinidad, and I know it's some extent is in Jamaica too, out of many one people, but in Trinidad, there is this saying, all are we is one. And this is something that, you know, everybody uses around carnival time. So everybody could drink and party and so on. But after that, everyone go back to their particular group. And we pretend that these things don't exist.
Yes.
So our economic elites are aligned with the Western economic elites.
And that
right?
is
As
the
a
bottom.
parasitic class.
Yes, and that is the crux of the matter in terms of and you mentioned earlier that the people are the ones who will make the difference and need to make the difference. The extent to which people are doing that, I think, is something that we can discuss. But before we do that, I want to pay some attention to because Venezuela is what has happened now. The attack, the kidnapping of Maduro and his wife. We haven't seen the wife yet, but we heard she's been kidnapped. Also, the fact that we've heard the President of the United States, Donald Trump, saying we will run Venezuela. I know you very well, and I know, and this is an aside, I know that you probably thought of already Harry Belafonte's Matilda, because he says, you know, they're going to run Venezuela. Matilda take the money and she won't go in Venezuela.
Yeah.
But the point to make is, all right, the armada that has been in the Caribbean water for the last 28 weeks and some. This is the biggest armada since the Iraq War, anywhere. Assembled anywhere. This was warfare. It was obvious. And this armada has been sitting in Caribbean waters for over 28 weeks. The silence of CARICOM, the silence of a lot of the people of the Caribbean on what was happening in the Caribbean waters, this is telling. What lessons can we learn from this? The amount of calls I'm getting now to say, did you think this would happen? Are you shocked? No, we're not shocked because the armada has been there. But yet CARICOM ignored it to a large extent. What is your thinking on how this has been dealt with and continues to be dealt with by CARICOM as a body and by Caribbean people?
So what I said a couple of days ago, even before the attacks on Venezuela, is one, the fear factor. People are scared. When I was younger, I'll give you this as an example. You read books and you hear about troops and the way sometimes the propaganda, when you listen to war, you read reports on war, 100,000 troops and 200,000 troops and so on. And when you use the word troop, it appears to be something not human. So the fact is that soldiers are human who can bleed and die, like all of us. Okay? That the propaganda of war instills fear in people. And what the West and particularly the United States have done is to be able to create narratives of fear, to make people believe that they are stronger than they are, and so you have this element of fear that is that exists. The second factor is you also have this narrative control. We are very much propagandized in the Caribbean and socialized in Western ways of thinking. And C.L.L. James alluded to that in a quote. He said, we are both African, but we are also European, in that we, to some extent, we are Eurocentric. And we being in this part of the world, this hemisphere, we are very much impacted by U.S. propaganda, right? What must happen is that there has to be an education process from the ground up, right? We have to go back to educating our people again to to make them understand their own humanity and to understand that there are things we must be prepared to fight for. You know, our leaders will never teach us those lessons because they are tools of U.S. imperialism. They are puppets, most of them, if not all of them, with the exception of Cuba, of U.S. imperialism and Western hegemony. And so those of us who are conscious, those who do the work like what you are doing on this radio station, we have to re-educate our people to understand that there are things we must be prepared to stand up for and things that we must be prepared to fight for. That, to me, is one of the ways of combating what I consider this whole imperialist trust in the Caribbean. We have resisted in the past because we knew who we were. Right now, we are confused about who we are as a people in the Caribbean. And so we have to return to who we are, return to the words of our ancestors and our prophets, those who fought against this very system when it appeared in the form of slavery, when it appeared in the form of colonialism, and now it appears as neocolonialism and imperialism. And our people have to learn what this is. We have to learn what this economic model of capitalism is, and we have to fight to create something different. As Fidel will always say, we have to imagine a different world. And I believe once we can begin to imagine a different world, it will impose on us responsibilities to act in a manner consistent with our own reality and with our own interests.
Line, my very special guest is Brother Ako Mutota, and in wearing his hat of a geopolitical analyst this morning as we look at the Caribbean within the geopolitical context. Brother Ako, one thing we have learned, and we are learning during this period of the Trump-Monroe Doctrine corollary, and, if you will, the Monroe Doctrine on steroids and the Manifest Destiny. One thing we're learning is the extent or the characteristics of the leadership. If we weren't sure before, and you alluded to it just before the break, we are very clear now on where the leadership of individual Caribbean countries stand in relation to Western imperialism and the extent, whether they have bought into it, because their silence we can only judge, whether they've bought into the enslavement or the re-enslavement of Caribbean people, or, as you mentioned before, they themselves are feeling fear and without courage. What can you tell us about what you, in particular, what you're noticing and what you're learning, if anything, more about the leadership of individual Caribbean countries and collectively in this crisis?
I was telling someone yesterday who called me about this situation in Venezuela, and I was telling the person, I've been fighting this thing for 50 years, trying to make people understand what neocolonialism is, what this kakistocratic class of leaders are. But, it's interesting enough. There is an article that was written by a Trinidadian scholar a couple of weeks ago called Macaulay's Men. I will send it to you when I can find it.
Yes,
but
please.
It refers to a Lord Macaulay, who was an official of the British colonial government in India. And one of the things he said in fighting to maintain British colonization in India is to create a group of people. He said they'll be Indian in color, brown, but mentally, culturally, and otherwise, they would be British. And the article the brother wrote was called Macaulay's Men. This was the theory that Lord Macaulay put forward.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at Caribbean leadership, all of these people are Macaulay's men.
Mm-hmm.
And women.
Yes.
That's something that, Mia Motley may be different. I'm not so sure. She makes some good statements at times. But my thing is, it is one thing to talk, and which is what Caribbean leaders have been good at, to talk to our emotion. They have embraced things like working class speeches and so on. And Professor Hilborn makes an important distinction about Aaron Barrow in Barbados. Mm-hmm. He said Barrow was pro-worker, but he was pro-working class. And that's a distinction.
Yes.
Right? So they can attempt like Siaga in Jamaica, who did a lot of work on the Rasta movement and certain kinds of research on African culture in Jamaica. Mm-hmm. But Siaga was an unrepentant imperialist, a capitalist.
Yes.
You know? And so sometimes we get confused when these people show empathy and sympathy and alignment with some of the things that we consider important. But we have to make that distinction that these people are Macaulay men. Mm-hmm. They do not serve our interests. Mm-hmm. They serve the interests of our foreign ideas, foreign cultures, and imperialism and Western hegemony. That's who they are. And the struggle is not to put new faces in power. The struggle is to destroy the whole system and create something different. And that is why Cuba is attacked. Venezuela is attacked. For all the contradictions you may think Cuba has, and it has, and Venezuela. But the fact is that they are trying something different. They are trying to create new systems, new approaches, new organizing of economies. We can't have economies where 2% of the people benefit from the economic structure while 98% of the people live hand to mouth, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And so Caribbean leaders are people who really don't serve the interests of Caribbean people. And the system itself, right, the way it is designed, cannot serve our interests. And we must come to the realization that these political and economic systems were never meant to serve our interests. And therefore, we have to challenge them and change them.
Because as this for us, the Armada in the Caribbean waters represents for us the biggest test for the Caribbean in a very long time. And we have silence to a large extent from Caribbean leaders. We have threats, of course, coming from the U.S. and so on. But at the same time, on the backside of the attack, let us take a look at what CARICOM has said in terms of its statement. We are monitoring the situation. This is CARICOM's statement. We are monitoring the situation. Before the attack, CARICOM was silent. Those who had the audacity to merely whisper dissent, like Antigua and Barbuda and Dominica, they are now under attack themselves in terms of these countries. The U.S. has suspended its visa program with these countries. And then in terms, instead of taking on the system, the imperialistic system, Caribbean leaders on this very issue have turned against themselves, seeing who can outdo the other to be America's best friend. Trinidad, of course, and Guyana winning that competition. But I think more than any time, it is sending a message to us that we are on our own. What then do you think Caribbean people need to do, especially at a moment when now we are more aware of exactly where we stand in the geopolitics of it all?
So Kabu, the thing is about this CARICOM thing. These Caribbean leaders, as you said in your statement, those who whispered, and they are mealy-mouthed people who say one thing on one side of their mouth and do something else, right? These people, you know, my mother has a term she uses, my 94-year-old mother. She calls them court jesters. You know?
Yes.
They are nothing more than court jesters, dancing to the tune of their masters.
Very Shakespearean, you know? Yes.
The famous line, whose bread I eat is whose song I sing.
Yes.
Anyone who will give them bread, that's whose song they will sing. Occasionally, they will make a statement that may surprise you, right? Mm-hmm. But the matter is always in the hands of the people, right? Caribbean people have to realize that we are one people. You know, I was talking to a group a couple of weeks ago and using the analogy of the Chinese Civil War. The communists and the Kuomintang, the nationalists, were fighting in the Chinese Civil War. And when the Japanese invaded, despite being sworn enemies ideologically, when the Japanese invaded, they formed what was called a united front to fight the Japanese invasion. And when the Japanese were defeated, they went back to fighting each other, which ended up in the Chinese Communist Party winning the Civil War and now governs China. But the most important lesson, I think, here for Caribbean people, that the Chinese would have taught us in this situation, is to understand what are your primary contradictions and what are your secondary contradictions. Mm-hmm. The primary contradictions for the Chinese was the Japanese invasion. Their secondary contradiction was the conflict between them. Mm-hmm. And so they were able to denote that quite clearly, what their primary contradictions were and what their secondary contradictions were. And so they moved accordingly. What has happened in the Caribbean here is because of the confusion and the misleadership of these so-called leaders, we do not understand our primary contradictions and what are our secondary contradictions. So we fight each other for nonsense. Mm-hmm. You understand? When we should be looking at how do we as a group of people with similar historical and cultural experiences, right, band ourselves together to carve a space in the world that would be to our benefit. Mm-hmm. And that to me is what somehow we have to aim with. What ideas are going to guide us, right? You know, is it going to be socialism? Is it going to be some kind of shared values philosophy, right? All of these, to me, are the things we need to be discussing. You know, there was a former president of Trinidad and Tobago, Ellis Clark, who, you know, we never had much respect for because he was always in a party and cocktail drinking. But he made one statement that was very profound. He said, a person without a philosophy is like a vagrant.
Mm-hmm, yep.
You know?
Yes.
So vagrancy is not just the homeless person in the street. Mm-hmm. It is a person who has no philosophy, a person who believes that the pursuit of profit is the only reason for existing as a human being. And so we have to understand the role of philosophy. We have to understand what primary contradictions and secondary contradictions are, and develop ideas and operations and activities that can unite us moving forward, whether we're in Jamaica, St. Vincent, Barbados. That is what, in my opinion, we have to do. The Caribbean leaders, yes, and the systems of governance in the Caribbean has failed. We can no longer rely on them, right? Especially given what you just said about what happened with CARICOM. When in a moment of crisis, they could not offer leadership, they could not even offer a good word of advice. They just rolled over like puppies and danced to the tune of the court master like court jesters.
It is an embarrassment, and I'm not quite sure if they're able to recognize that, because the leadership lacks empathy. The people are locked into a paradigm that is frightening. We have people who are going against the system, the status quo. We have Mamdani in New York. We have, regardless of what you think of him, we have in Burkina Faso an example in the alliance of the AES. We have examples of how nations can stand up and leaders can stand up against imperialism, oppression, and ongoing colonialism. As I'm saying this to you, I am very aware that the armada with the biggest warship in the world, quite likely, are still in the Caribbean waters. I am very aware that Caribbean countries are under threat, because we heard at the press conference yesterday, for the three persons who spoke, that basically Caribbean leaders, Caribbean countries, Caribbean people are being threatened. If you do not behave, they say, then this is also likely to happen to you. They have pointed to Cuba. Literally, Cuba is next from what they're saying, because now they're on a roll. So Caribbean, I'm aware that the Caribbean is under threat. But isn't it when the Caribbean is under threat that leaders rise in courage? What is happening?
Yes. Go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead. Brother.
No, I'm saying yes. And leaders are emerging. What I think is happening, it is that we are not seeing. I think in the Caribbean at times, and for a long time in our history, our leadership has been centered around the messianic idea. You know, I remember when I was in Jamaica at the conference of the PNP, Manley as the leader. Manley was Joshua. Joshua.
Yeah.
And so we have had this idea of leadership, a sort of messianic idea of leadership. What in European history they call the great man theory. So we always look for a great man, a Marcus Garvey or Eric Williams or somebody like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what is happening now is that the leadership is becoming more egalitarian. That's why we seem to think it doesn't exist, but it does. Right?
Leaderfulness as opposed to leadership. The leaderfulness. The leaders are rising up across the Caribbean, you're saying, and this is organic because people are...
Yes.
Yeah. I take the point you're making.
That's why I said in the beginning it is a moment of despair.
Yeah.
Right? But there are young people I speak to. I think I sent you a couple of the statements coming up of Trinidad, even among Indian people who are supposed to be the strongest supporters of Kamala for stability, who are attacking this idea of our subservience and our vassal state. Right? Some of these people, you don't know them. But when you look at the ideas and what they're expressing, obviously they have some leadership capabilities. Mm-hmm. So there is, whenever, they say there's one action, there's always an equal and opposite reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And so this pressure campaign with this armada outside of our coast will produce leaders and is producing leaders, young people in the Caribbean, who will emerge, I believe, to challenge this hegemony. I'm very optimistic about that. There are some people who tend to believe that young people are aimless and so on. I remember, as I reminded someone, people say the same thing about us when we listen to reggae music in Trinidad. They talk about, dirty, that nasty Rasta music, and so on. Every generation sometimes have a tendency to be critical of the next one.
Yes.
Yes. And so I don't want us to fall into that. And then they create these abstract terms like Generation Y and Z, which alienate the elders from the young people.
Look at the Caribbean and the geopolitical issues that are now. We're in literally a geopolitical storm. The Caribbean is in that. But finally, I want you to spend some time looking at the where we go from here. Because the solutions are always as important as identifying and naming the problem. The Armada, the attack on Venezuela, that was always going to happen. This is, as you pointed out earlier, an empire, an entire system is dying, and so they're doing what they do. It's a global reset. So at some point, we expect, if not Venezuela, Cuba, if not Cuba, somebody else. To what extent are other Caribbean countries likely to experience, if not quite the bombing or the kidnapping of the husband and wife from out of the bed, but America's or the system's full wrath? And then where do we go from here? I guess it's a question. KSR community.
So I think I know where do we go. It's very, very important that we discuss that. But just to go back to what you asked about the Sahel, 15 years ago, no one thought in the Sahel there would have been a Ibrahim Traore.
Mm-hmm.
You see, and out of this seamless, hopeless despairing situation. This young man, 30 years, 20 years, 30 years, I think, emerged. And I think we are going to have, this in the Caribbean. I think you're going to see young people emerging and challenging the status. But we, the elders, have to continue to educate them and guide them. And, know when to step aside. I went to a seminar at one point, an educator I brought to Trinidad. He taught a very interesting lesson. He said, in the past, a teacher used to be a sage on the stage. Now a teacher has to be a guide to the side. Mm-hmm. And so I think the day of the sage on the stage is past, and the guide to the side is what we have to, demonstrate now as teachers and as leaders.
Yes,
yes. But where do we go from here? Let me quote Gramsci here on this, on modernity, because we live in the modern world. He says here, the challenge of modernity is to live without illusions and without becoming disillusioned. He said, I am pessimistic because of my intelligence, but I am an optimist because of my will. Mm-hmm. He said, because of my will, I am an optimist. Mm-hmm. And Fidel Castro would always say, we have to imagine a different world, right? Mm-hmm. And so if we were to fuse both Fidel and Gramsci, I would say, where do we go from here? Is to create a different society, to will something into being, will a new existence into reality, and not the existence that we have of destitution, poverty, homelessness, of a parasitic class exploiting our resources and working in tandem with interests that have no care for our being and for our humanity. So we have to imagine this different world. And in imagining this different world, we then can create a future for ourselves. This is where I think the Caribbean must go, right? Mm-hmm. We have the will, right? And if you want to see will demonstrated, all you have to do is look at the Jamaican track team and what it has done in the world in the last 20 years, if not more. Yes. You understand? Mm-hmm. The will to succeed, right? One of the poorest countries in the world, right, has produced some of the best athletes in the world. Mm-hmm. That didn't just take just physical attributes, it took will. And so this is an example of how we can create a world that is better and a world where we can triumph, right, with some degree of humanity. That's what I would say.
Yes, and I add to that to say, you talk about the track, and I'll add to that Rastafari, which was which remains the only indigenous response to oppression and slavery and ongoing colonization in the region. Coming out of the belly of Jamaica, and so we put that there. But and then also reggae music, and I'm saying this to say that I am agreeing with the point you're making, that we do have the will, we can make the difference, and sometimes we are overthinking it because this is politics, and how do you do this? But Rastafari was a response to oppression and continues to be a response to oppression. Maybe what it needs and what it should take is a return to the Rastafari philosophies, to look again at how we stood up against imperialism, ongoing colonialism, and oppression. This is just my 2 cents throwing in there to back what you just said, Brother Akko. But yes, go ahead.
You are so correct. I'll give you an example of the power of Rastafarianism in the Caribbean. Right? I am a vegetarian today because of Rastafarianism in the Caribbean.
Well, there you go.
Because when the Rastas began to talk about ITAL and no salt in your food and all of these kinds of things, a lot of us began to do concrete research, and it made sense.
Yes.
Now, it may have been a mythological concept, who knows, coming from people who live, whose lived experiences told them certain things. But it matched the science that if you don't eat copious amount of salt and certain kinds of food, you are going to be healthy.
Yes.
And that has permeated so the Rasta movement has done more for health in the Caribbean than all the ministries of health combined throughout the entire Caribbean. And as we are moving away from those indigenous philosophies, you are seeing what is happening: diabetes, high blood pressure. We We have the highest concentration of high blood pressure in the world compared. I think us and African Americans have, and we are a resistant type of high blood pressure, according to research done.
Yeah.
Right, that the medicines don't work on us. And so what Rastafarianism taught us is that if we move to an indigenous philosophy and indigenous approaches to living, it can transform modern life into comfortable realities.
And there you go. And I want to end it on that note, because I think we have answers. We have answers if we go all the way back and forward to the continent of Africa, and we have answers from the belly of we the people. And it's what I think it takes is for us to look again at ourselves, because it is within us that the answers.
Absolutely, Sister Kabu, and that word you just used there. I think we have a couple minutes. It's a term Cheryl James used in an interview or discussion. Somebody alluded that, well, we behave a certain way because we lost everything, and Cheryl corrected the person said, no, we came with ourselves.
That's right.
You understand? He said we came with ourselves, and therefore we had ourselves, and we still have ourselves. It is just that it is confused and conflicted by narratives meant to entrap us. And so we have to return to selfhood, to ourselves, to a philosophy based on humanity, right? An ideological base that is based on man and woman.
Brother Akomotota, thank you so much. I know we're going to talk to you. I know you have a program today, later on today. Is the program on today?
No, the sister is out of the country, so we rescheduled.
So I'm very happy that you could join us. As you know, we're going to be speaking with Brother Isaac Seni right after this. And throughout the morning, this is the issue we're looking at, but we're also going to be looking at the Horn of Africa, because, everything is connected. And what we see,
everything is connected.
Yeah, so we're making that link on the Horn of Africa this morning. Thank you so much, Brother Akomotota. As I was saying before, I know we're going to talk again, because there's a fluid situation happening.
Yes, thank you very much, Sister Kabu, and good morning to your listening audience once again. And I wish everyone in Jamaica speedy recovery from the ravages of the hurricane.
Thank you so
much. And let us know, and we stand as one Caribbean people. All power to the people of the Caribbean and the people of Jamaica.
Thank you so much, Brother Akomotota. Thank you so much. My next very special guest, Professor Isaac Seni. Professor Isaac Seni is a Black Studies and Cuba specialist and coordinator of the Black and African Diaspora Studies program at Dalhousie University. He holds a PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. His teaching, research and scholarship encompass Cuba, Africa, the Caribbean, Black Canadian history, the global Black liberation struggle, and reparations. A major area of his research is Cuba's relationship with Africa. And we'll tell you more about him as the morning goes on. Professor Isaac Seni is joining me on the phone lines right now. Brother Isaac, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us inside of the Africa Forum.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you for having me.
All right. Really appreciate
pleasure to be here.
Really appreciate you coming on. First, let me just get your initial reaction, because we are looking at the attack on Venezuela. We're looking at the responses, but we want to contextualize this in the historical context. Before that, though, your initial response to what is transpiring right now in the Caribbean waters.
Well, I think many of us anticipated there would be an attack because the U.S. had, they had the largest aircraft carrier there, the Gerald Ford, and, they deployed all of these troops, and it was costing them $18 million U.S. today, at least conservatively, to maintain it there, right? But also it's important in the sense that, the Trump had, basically promulgated issued their national security strategy, which declared that they had, in a sense, U.S. imperialism had neglected the Americas, and they were going to reestablish their control over the entire region. And so many people have written about and talked about the Monroe Doctrine, was established in the 1820s, where the U.S. basically said that the Americas were basically going to be its exclusive sphere of influence, okay, and nobody else was going to be allowed. And then, of course, today the U.S. is very angry or upset over the extent of Chinese investment, for example, in Latin America and the Caribbean. But there's also the idea of manifest destiny, which is this white supremacist vision, right, of who should direct and control affairs in the region. And so, in a sense, there's a lot of continuity, and there's a lot of, shall we say, new degeneracy here in terms of the level of destruction and so forth. I don't think I need to tell your listeners or anyone, or even you, the litany, the numerous interventions that the United States has carried on in the region in the 20th century. For example, beginning with the seizing of Puerto Rico and Cuba in the 1890s. We can even go up to the Green Age Revolution. What happened in Guatemala in 1954 and so forth. So the U.S. has frequently intervened in the region. We've been referred to as the American backyard. The idea is that in a sense that this region should always be controlled by the United States. And in the context of this early 21st century, where the U.S. is in economic decline, it's still the most powerful imperial country because of its military might, but it's an economic decline. There was a feeling that, what is necessary for the United States to be able to maintain its hegemony and its global dominance is it needs to retrench itself in the Americas. And so there was a feeling that was articulated in the Trump administration that the Latin America and the Caribbean had, in a sense, been neglected, right? And what had happened was that various geopolitical rivals had begun to find some footholds, and the U.S. needed to reassert its hegemony as well. And it's also important to understand the U.S. will not stand any kind of independence, right, for any Caribbean and Latin American country. It's an anathema to them. Okay, it must be crushed, it must be negated. And in that context, we can look at what happened with the Haitian Revolution, when we have, enslaved Africans, right, rising up, right, establishing the first Black Republic, right, stunning the imperial powers that be, who might have been at each other's throats, but were united in trying to crush out this example of African freedom, this example of anti-colonial, right, national liberation. And so, as we all know, Haiti was diplomatically and economically isolated, right, and crucified. And then we see sort of like a parallel between what happened to the Haitian Revolution and what the U.S. has attempted to impose on Cuba. A reflection of that siege that was imposed as well. So any form of independence, any form of self-determination that challenges U.S. hegemony always faces extreme pressures from the United States, imperialist aggression, from economic sanctions to outright invasion. And we see in the case of Venezuela here what has unfolded. People familiar when Chavez came to power, the attempt to use the resources of Venezuela to the benefit of the Venezuelan people. Mm-hmm. The kind of social programs that were funded in Venezuela and so forth. And then Venezuela also began, like Cuba had projected with its internationalism. Venezuela had the economic wherewithal to actually do a significant amount of economic internationalism, so to speak, with Petrocaribe and so forth. So these things had to be snuffed out. So in a sense, the U.S. is just retrenching itself. It wants to be the global hegemon on the world scale. It also, in many ways, is looking to acquire those resources. It's no coincidence that places like Venezuela sit on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, right? Mm-hmm. We see the attacks on Nigeria, right? Okay, yes. Nigeria also with its oil reserves and its gold and its resources and so forth. And of course, we see, with the genocide in Gaza, there's all sorts of gas offshore of Gaza. But when we look at the genocides and the horrors unfolding in the Sudan and the Congo, I have the resources that exist in those African countries, in the African continent as a whole, sort of rarely provides a simple explanation for why the U.S. is determined to undermine, and not only in Latin America, but across the world, any government, any attempt to challenge those imperial control and so forth. And so Venezuela, it was a shock. It was horrible to see the kidnapping of the president, but it's also a horrible violation of international law. And I could go on and on. I don't want to belabor the point.
You've touched on international law. law, which let's go there, because as you talk about violations, help us to understand what are the violations of international law?
Well, the violations of international is fundamentally the sovereignty of nations. Okay, it's important to understand that, as limited as international law was, right, and in fact, as Eurocentric as it was, as it emerged, it came out of the Second World War. It came out after that tremendous bloodletting and destruction, right? And so the idea was they would establish, international laws and norms that would make these kind of vicious attacks, beyond the pale. For example, seizing the resources of another country, right? Okay, annexation of territory, territorial expansion through annexation of other countries' territory, and so forth. And then, when the great anti-colonial national liberation struggles emerged in Latin America and Africa and elsewhere, international law was expanded by the movements of the global South to include fundamental ideas like right of self-determination and stuff, for example, of right to development. All of that has been thrown, in a sense, into the garbage, right? Mm-hmm. And in fact, the idea that might makes right was supposed to have been buried. The idea that force was the primary means by which you settle international disputes was supposed to be buried. We have now returned to a time when might makes right, when all that matters is imperial power, right? Mm-hmm. And that issues of self-determination and sovereignty are gone. And so the U.S. can just, and Trump can just say quite clearly, I will seize the resources of other countries, right? Because, we need it. And, of course, it's important to understand that when he's saying we, there's this attempt to create this idea that he represents the entirety of the nation of the country of the United States, the citizens. But it's really this clique of the financial oligarchy that wishes to enrich itself. So, so Venezuela made it very clear that they wanted, even up before the kidnapping of Maduro, that they wanted the oil, right? Okay, mm-hmm. And that they were going to take this oil, and we were going to take our oil back, is what he actually said, right? Mm-hmm. Because Venezuela, under international law, had actually, nationalized and compensated the U.S. companies, but nationalized those resources, right? To better actually, in a sense, have control over those resources so they could benefit, its nations and so forth. And of course, he's now said, not only will they've got rid of Maduro, he's basically said, I don't know how they're going to do it. They have to put boots on the ground, that they will control Venezuela, directly administer it. He's going to bring in all of these U.S. companies into the oil industry in Venezuela, and therefore seize the resources. And then, of course, your listeners are probably very well aware that he's turned his sights on Greenland, right? Yes. Greenland, which has all of these minerals, and Denmark itself has declared now apparently that they consider the U.S. to be a national security threat, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, we see this right across, and the global South, where those countries that have these minerals, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, that are central to Western imperialism, particularly to U.S. imperial power. Those countries are in threat of being directly intervened in by the United States if they don't follow the diktat of Washington. And of course, your listeners, I'm sure, well aware historically that if you go back to the early 60s, right? Yes. We think of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. That was the great crime he made. Was the idea of actually achieving Congo's independence and attempting to use its vast minerals, right? Just even the idea of using its vast minerals for the benefit of its people, right, was something that was completely unacceptable to them. And so international law, and when I was in law school, and I remember I focused on international law, I had a professor who believed deeply in these principles, right? Yes. Okay, and so, but we don't have the rule of law anymore, right? It's terrifying. And for countries such as the Caribbean, who are often dismissed as microstates, right? Okay, however symbolic international law may have been, it was a very important shield for small countries that have very little power and often fall prey to imperial powers, which is why so many of us have been, in a sense, very disconcerted, upset by the fact that, Trinidad and Tobago at one stage openly and enthusiastically sort of embraced, the increased U.S. aggressions and imperial presence that was emerging in the region and so forth. What happens to the dream of Caribbean unity, right? Are we not better to working together, cooperating together, collaborating together as the Caribbean in order to make our way in what is an increasingly dangerous world?
But I hear you saying, and you've also written about this, that and you've posed a question as to whether the dream of one Caribbean is ending changing or being renewed. From an anti-colonial standpoint, is CARICOM structurally capable of resisting this imperial power, or was it always designed to manage dependency and to try to overcome it?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and that's a debate and a discussion I've had with many of my friends. We felt that CARICOM, but obviously almost all of the Caribbean governments have been top down, right? Instead of empowering the masses, right? Instead of basically not only involving them in participatory decision making, right, but unleashing their profound creativity that they have. And so CARICOM itself tended to be, quite slow, technocratic, elitist, and so forth, right? And focused on, states as opposed to directly empowering people. But the fact that it exists itself, right, is important in of itself. The question is whether it can be renewed in today's conditions. It's a profound question, and that's why I think we need to have a revival of the progressive movements in the Caribbean, right, to push these governments, if not in order to establish, hopefully, progressive governments, right, governments that can reflect the aspirations of the people. And I know I'm not really giving you a concrete answer, right? Mm-hmm. And so what? There's some people who would actually argue, and I think they'd make a very strong point, that we have to return to radical traditions, right? Mm-hmm. Where ultimately, we have to establish people-centered societies, not centered around capital and so forth. Can CARICOM be an instrument? Can it be renewed? Or is it too stuck in the mud? Is another question, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. But, it's interesting that, CARICOM itself has been seen as an obstacle, right? Yes. To these plans the United States has, right? Like, for example, we have critics, right, of the African Union, right? Mm-hmm. Okay? And people have lots of criticisms of the African Union, that it was a compromise when it was created. It was, in a sense, didn't really deeply organizationally embody the Pan-African ideas, because it rooted power in all of these individual states, right? Mm-hmm. But even the existence of the African Union is seen as something that either must be undermined, if not completely negated, by the United States. So any example of independence, right, yes, however small it might be, is unacceptable for the imperial powers. And I'm hoping, and this is one of the points I made in the article that was published, right, is I made the point that you have even our elites, which tend to be comprador elites, right? And they're under tremendous pressures, right? I mean, I know these governments are under tremendous pressures, economically, diplomatically, questions of taking away visas. So many people in Caribbean islands have visas and relatives in have visas and also have relatives, right, in the United States that would like to visit, and get worried about being cut off from them. So I understand the immense pressures, but there's some of them who believe that by kowtowing to the United States, okay, that somehow this gives them proximity to power and therefore power, as if the United States, as if Trump, in this new level of degeneracy of U.S. imperialism, would care less about the Caribbean, care less about people he considers not to be inferior, if not really truly human, right? I mean, the kind of white supremacist ideology that comes out of the United States, right? Plus its imperial and capitalist drive for profit and to dominate resources makes it very improbable in my eyes, incredulous in my eyes, that the United States would actually take into consideration anything about the necessary developmental needs of the Caribbean and so forth. And my last point is this, is that also one of my main concerns about what is the momentum that was developed for reparations, right? Okay, yes. The CARICOM case for reparations. What happens to that? And I know, I have I talk with a lot of colleagues who are involved in the reparations case and so forth. And while in one sense we're glad the CARICOM case was going forward, we thought it really wasn't rooted in the people itself. It was too state-centric. But even that is unacceptable to the United States. It was
hijacked, though. It was totally hijacked.
It was hijacked, yeah.
And this is where
what happens to climate change? How do we deal with climate change?
But
right?
Isn't CARICOM speaking with one voice on climate change? We have Jamaican member of Parliament heading up the United Nations treaty body on climate change. But they speak with forked tongues, though, because they speak, and head up these bodies. But take Jamaica, for example, we find ourselves with our backs against a wall, being pushed out of every single access to every single beach, access to the water, access to fresh water, access to rainwater, access to the ocean. So there is a serious contradiction. But Brother Isaac, let me take a quick break because I want to come back to look at ask you to put on your history, Professor Hart, for a minute to talk about the extent to which this time in the Caribbean resembles, if you will, the 1930s or not. But let me take a quick break.
Safe, reliable, great value. Always buy from an authorized IGL dealer. The time by IGL is
now 7:47. You're inside of the Africa Forum, and we're speaking with my very special guest, Professor Isaac Sene. Brother Isaac, I'm just looking and reading again the Monroe Doctrine and the Manifest Destiny and all of what we see happening around us with the Horn of Africa and everything else, Ukraine, you name it, all of this, Russia, the whole thing. I've been forced to go back to read my history book on the 1930s and what the conditions were like that led up to Japan's invasion of Manchuria and Italy's invasion of Ethiopia that ultimately led to World War II. Put on your history hat for me, please, and talk to us about how the parallels that we're witnessing, if any.
And that's a common thing. People are saying we're returning to pre-World War II conditions with all of these contradictions, right? Yes. And so forth. And, I'm very happy you mentioned that when people normally think of World War II, they always talk about the German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, but the invasion of Manchuria, by, as you pointed out, by Japan, right? And, leading to the horrible loss of death, we call it the Chinese Holocaust, right? Yes. And the Japanese visited upon the Chinese, and the invasion of Ethiopia, right, in 35. These were precursors, right? Because it began in the global south, right? And so what we see, as we see these geopolitical rivalries emerge, is, we find that now the global south becomes a space, right, where before there were the ideas that, after the Second World War, that colonization and direct control of these countries, right, was completely unacceptable. We seem to be returning to that phase, right? Trump, as I said, in terms of Venezuela, is openly talking about directly administering Venezuela as a state and directly controlling its resources. So it's very dangerous in that sense, right? And what happens is that, we don't have these international treaties that emerged after the Second World War, from the Geneva Conventions to, the Convention on Genocide and the United Nations Charter. So all of that has been thrown to the ground. And we're now back into imperial rivalries, right? And I think that's where we're at right now. We have different blocs have emerged. Okay, and we have the United States. I mean, the difference, of course, is the U.S., at the time wasn't the global hegemon, right? The U.S. is now, is the global hegemon in decline. Its share of the global economy has been shrinking, and there's been this fear that was articulated, I would argue, since the early 2000s. We have the Project for the American Century. We talked about how to restore U.S. domination. So I think when we look at what's the 30s, I think it provides a very good historical analogy, right? We had the global south, the number of independent countries didn't exist. Africa was still under, 90% of it was still under European control, right? And so forth. And if we take into consideration once Ethiopia had been occupied, right, by Italy, it's more than 90%. The Caribbean was still colonized as well. We had massive colonies, divided between Britain, France, and Holland in Asia as well, right? So, in a sense, it seems that the goal is not only to eviscerate international law, right, and shatter these ideas of sovereignty and right of self-determination, but in a sense to return the global south to subjugation. At least that's the vision of that's clearly and openly articulated by Donald Trump and so on. But also, the last point I'd like to make is also the 30s, and we know in the Caribbean, right, the 30s was also a time of the rebirth of nationalism, or the rebirth of the ideas of independence, right? Okay. We have worker struggles, right? And national struggles throughout the Caribbean, right? I mean, and when I think of Trinidad, right? And the Baptist uprisings, right? Okay. Well, not to call it the Baptist, but the workers' uprisings and so forth, and the suppression of the Southern Baptists, for example, right? We have all of these things. So we have that happening as well. Now, the question is, will we have a rebirth of that in our time? And, I was looking before we got, I joined the conversation.
Yes.
And I was looking at a WhatsApp group of that's based in the Caribbean, right, of colleagues of mine and progressives of mine who were talking about, where does the new resurgence of independence come from, or progressive movements come from, right? Okay, we had people who were organizing in the 30s and so forth. So there's one. So I think, in a sense, that's what we have to look for, the rekindling, right, as in the 30s, of these ideas of independence, the intellectuals who came out, right, and were speaking. He mentioned C.L.R. James was mentioned by a brother Akko in the earlier interview, right? Yes. We have others who are talking. George Padmore, I can mention, right? Okay, we had people who were trade union activists, people who talked about independence, people who are Pan-Africanists, right? Who are very rooted in the communities organizing. We're waiting for that new generation to emerge as well. But the last point I'd make, I think you're quite right. It's a very dangerous situation. The 1930s was a time of lawlessness, right? Okay, but despite the League of Nations, right, which was completely powerless, right? Okay, like the United Nations seems now, to stop these aggressions, right? What eventually happened was the 30s exploded into World War II, the most destructive world conflict ever, okay, that, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, millions, tens of millions of lives across the world, right? And people tend to think of Europe and so forth, where many of the major battles were fought. Well, we tend to forget that, the Caribbean was drawn into it. Africa was drawn into it in terms of resources, in terms of providing manpower and so forth. And, when I think of the historical parallels, and I think particularly of Trinidad and Tobago, where bases being established in Trinidad, particularly the radar station in Tobago. When I think of Marines being deployed in Trinidad and Tobago and so forth, it kind of reminds me of what was happening in the 1930s. I mean, in World War I in Trinidad and Tobago, because Trinidad had the largest refinery at that time during World War II in the British Empire, and so it was an extremely important strategic location, right? And so forth. In fact, people often point out, and it seems that most of the U-boats that were sunk, the German submarines that were sunk during World War II, most of them were sunk off in an area of the Trinidad and Tobago, not too far. So one of the problems is that, when war breaks out, when these conflicts break out, smaller countries from the global south are drawn in and so forth. And as we know, there is no concern for lives of people from the global south, much less for people of African descent.
Yes. You mentioned just now the League of Nations and the United Nations. And do you see parallels there too? The League, of course, coming out of World War I, it should never happen again. Died with the Emperor's speech to them, today for you, tomorrow for me. It was much more than today for me, tomorrow for you. It's much more than that, obviously. Yeah. But here we are now. The UN says it's going to meet tomorrow. The Security Council is going to meet tomorrow. But is it facing its League of Nations moment?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, one of the things about the League of Nations, one of the things that really, in a sense, doomed it, right, was the fact that the United States never joined it, right? And therefore, in a sense, we have Trump in today's conditions, withdrawing and delegitimizing the United Nations. So the U.S. has withdrawn from very important United Nations agencies such as UNESCO and so forth. And so the United Nations is at its historical moment. I have friends who are international lawyers, right, who work in the United Nations, who believe that international law, right, they believe firmly in these principles, is dead, right, and that somehow the United Nations has now become irrelevant, right, because it's been unable to stop the genocide in Gaza. It can't stop the genocide in the Sudan and Congo, and these have been going on for such a long period of time, right. It can issue resolutions condemning U.S. aggression against Venezuela, for example, that may come out. I mean, it's actually been since 1992 an annual resolution that's been voted on the United Nations condemning overwhelmingly the U.S. economic war against Cuba. And yet the U.S. economic war against Cuba continues, besieging the island and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. So there have always been questions about the efficacy of the United Nations. But those principles in international law of self-determination, of sovereignty, of the fact that you can't, that might does not make right, okay? Mm-hmm. That you can't go in and seize openly the resources of another country, right? Okay, mm-hmm. Those principles, however, they may have remained just as principles, and however they may have been subverted in a sense since the Second World War, are very important. And what the U.S. is doing now, in fact, it used to hide its interventions. It used to hide, behind, covert operations. Like, for example, when we think of what happened with Guatemala in 1954, the overthrow of our Benz. Mm-hmm. When we see what happened in Chile in 1973. Now, all this stuff is all open. Okay, yes. They make no bones about it. It's blatant, it's flagrant, it's brazen, and they articulate it as their fundamental right. Mm-hmm. So the United States at one point used to intervene and say, we're not doing this for resources, we're doing this for higher things, right? Trump is just, taking the mask off, the monster, and makes it very clear this is what we're doing for. We're seizing those resources, and we don't think you have any rights. Mm-hmm. Because I think it's important to understand that this foreign aggression of the United States in its this foreign policy of violence, right, of imperial aggression, also must be seen as part and parcel of what's going on inside the United States itself. The rolling back of the civil rights gains, right? The targeting of communities of color, right? The huge austerity that's unfolding in the United States as well. And I know a lot of people, tend to think, they cherish their visas to go to the United States, and they think of the United States as the land of hope and opportunity, of milk and honey and so forth. But things are very tough in the United States, okay, in terms of all of the kind of cutbacks and so forth that are unfolding, and the assault on what we would consider basic rights and so on, right? So I think those things are connected. And Martin Luther King himself, in his famous Beyond Vietnam speech, when he gave in Riverside Church in Harlem, in New York, in April of 1967, spoke about this violence in Vietnam. He spoke about what's connected to the kind of domestic, social and economic violence within the United States itself. So we're in a very dangerous situation. Mm-hmm. And I remember posting yesterday after the invasion that I look with tremendous apprehension to what's unfolding in the world. Quite concerned about what's happening, because does international law exist anymore? Does might make right? Is that just the most important principle that exists now? And, but at the end of the day, history has shown that, we have instances and we have tremendous examples, as you were pointing out in the discussion about Akko, of oppressed and exploited people challenging this and keeping the dream of a better world alive.
We're having very insightful discussion, a conversation with Brother Isaac Seni. Brother Seni, Cuba was threatened. Cuba's always been under threat, but we heard in the press conference yesterday, where Cuba was openly threatened by Marco Rubio and them. And then we also heard, and I want you to talk about these two things, where the President of the United States talk about, we will run Venezuela. What's your thinking on all of, on first of all, the running of Venezuela, and then to say this open threat against Cuba? What does that mean in the wider scheme of things?
Well, he said we're going to run Venezuela openly. It's like he's going to be, him. He's going to be running them himself. With people like Hegseth, right? Mm-hmm. The Secretary of War, and of course Rubio, right? The point is this: they don't actually control Venezuela at the moment. They have to put boots on the ground, right? Okay, yes. Okay. And we know it took over 500,000 troops in Iraq, and Venezuela is one much larger, is larger than Iraq, has a larger population, much more organized. It hasn't been like when they invaded Iraq in 2003. Iraq had been basically, shall we say, handicapped, when we use that term, by over 10 years of sanctions. Okay, so they're going to, and also, the geography of Venezuela is much different, right? There's the jungle areas, there's the mountainous areas, and so forth, and there is an organized core of Chavistas, right? Okay, a significant, large population, right, of people, right, who basically made gains from the Bolivarian revolution and measures, but more importantly, are Chavistas, right? Believe deeply in independence, and we've seen people go out into the streets. There are mass demonstrations that have taken place in Venezuela against the intervention, right? Okay, and in fact trying to defend the gains that they've had, right? And it's interesting that one of the things that he also said was that Machado, who had won the Peace Prize, I don't know what the Peace Prize means, if you can give it to her, right?
Peace Prize for war.
For war, right?
Yes.
That, she was there and, she had been in the election and she lost, and now he says she doesn't have enough support, she's not popular, right? So what does that say about what does that say about the fact that, basically speaking, they can administer the country? They're going to have to put boots on the ground, right?
Yes.
And that requires getting, really for the... in really getting the American public, right, to buy into this. Now, the polls in the United States show that the overwhelming majority of U.S. citizens, right, of the U.S. population opposes, right, this war in Venezuela, right? Precisely because, Trump, the MAGA base, has he run on the idea that America first. So I think the question is this: where is he going to get troops? Where is he going to get troops to occupy Venezuela, to administer it? Where is he going to get troops for Grenada? Not Grenada, for Greenland, sorry. Okay, where is he going to get troops for Nigeria, right? Because he's talking about all of these adventures. And talking with some people, is he going to have to bring back the draft? If he brings back the draft, right, we all remember what happened in the 1960s in the United States, right? So there will be mass opposition to that. And of course, it's different than the 60s because in the time of the 60s, the U.S. was in an upward economic curve, right? The economy was still growing. The U.S. was the unchallenged economic titan of the world, right? Right now, the U.S. economy is in crisis, right? There's all sorts of layoffs taking place, right? People are involved in 1, 2, 3, 4 different jobs, right? What they call the gig economy and so forth. So I don't know what he says, and we could administer the economy, but it's an outright statement that basically that his belief and the belief of the U.S. Financial oligarchy is that the resources of the region, right? Okay. Belong to the U.S. oligarchy, right? The financial oligarchy, right? Yes. And the people who live on those countries are just inconveniences, right? Okay, at best to be pawns to facilitate the exploitation of those resources, and it was to be completely swept aside, right? And so forth. But I think it's enraged a lot of people, and this kind of rhetoric, right, sort of demonstrates to them how much a danger U.S. imperialism and particularly the Trump regime represents at this particular time. And when it comes to Cuba, in that sense, there was the articulation by people like Rubio, right, who's really the architect of this whole Latin America first plan, right, that the road to Cuba, to Havana, runs through Caracas, right, okay, that there was this very strong connection between Venezuela and Cuba since the emergence of Chavez, his assumption of power, economic, diplomatic, and otherwise, and that by cutting off any connections to Venezuela, the Cuban Revolution would collapse. And it's important to understand that for over 65 years, the United States has waged an unrelenting campaign of economic strangulation and destabilization against the Cuban Revolution, because it represented, it comes out in U.S. documents. You can see these ideas expressed in the early 60s, that Cuba represented the unforgivable revolution, the unforgivable example that a nation could actually, take command of its destiny and use its own resources, however limited they might be, for the benefit of its people. And that actually came out when you read some of these documents where people, were early on in the Kennedy administration, you have a whole campaign of economic destabilization, psychological campaigns, assassination campaigns, and so forth. And so for 65 years, Cuba has resisted, right? Okay? And for your listeners, I think it would be good for them to actually Google what's called the Mallory Memorandum. And this is a memorandum that was now declassified in 1960 by Lester Mallory, who was Haslam, who was in the U.S. Department of State, and who writes this memorandum acknowledging that the Cuban government has majority support and therefore is very strong, and the only way the United States can destroy it is to deprive it, okay, of all of the things it needs, economically isolated, so the people starve to death, and therefore this will provoke an internal uprising. And so this has formed sort of like the framework, right, for the U.S. war against Cuba, and it's only intensified it. Trump actually added an additional 240 economic sanctions when he was in his first term in office against Cuba, directly targeting its energy. So the goal is to strangle Cuba. And I should make a point here as well, and I always like to make this because I've always forgotten that, there's this whole debate. Cuba's in an economic crisis, right? Cuba's economic problems, the result of Cuba's policies, right? Mistakes by the government. Socialism is always going to fail and can't run an economy, right? Or is it a result of the U.S. economic sanctions, right? And I always like to point out, well, we actually have a test case for this, because when Obama, whatever our criticisms of Obama, right? But when Obama was forced, because of pressure from Latin American countries, to lessen the sanctions against Cuba, and that began really officially announced on December the 17th, 2014, right? For those 2 years until Trump assumed the presidency, Cuba was economically flourishing, and Cuba hadn't changed its economic policies. Its revolutionary government still remained in place. So I think that 2 years provides some sort of very powerful insight into what is actually the cause of the U.S. economic problems. It's the U.S. economic siege, right? And their goal is to destroy Cuba as an example of independence, okay? So that, in a sense, basically speaking, the dream of independence and self-determination for the Latin American and the Caribbean can finally, in their eyes, be extinguished and so forth. So I think that's one of the things they're speaking about. But it's also important to bear in mind that as they have threatened Cuba, and, Rubio said, if I was the Cuban president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, I'd be very worried, as if they're planning to actually swoop in and grab him. They also threatened Mexico.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And he threatened Mexico. Is he going to invade Mexico? Right. I mean, so he's talking about, as I said, he's going to. He said this. It's a fantasy. I'm going to directly administer and control Venezuela. But you have to actually make that the reality. So you have to deploy troops on the ground. You have to crush the resistance in Venezuela. You have to seize those resources and so forth. So he wants to do that. He wants to actually go after Colombia, because he's also described Petro as a problem. Right. Okay. He wants to go after Mexico. He wants to go after Cuba. They're carrying on this activity against Nigeria. He wants to seize Greenland. So where is he going to get the manpower, right, to put groups on the ground, as I said before? Are they going to have to implement another draft? And when they did the draft was one of the prime movers, right, for moving in the 60s, middle-class white Americans in opposition to Vietnam War, right? Okay? And because, many of these people, they had their careers interrupted, right? Okay? So, and we know that disproportionately people of African descent in the United States, and people from Latin American descent were represented in the army fighting in Vietnam, and therefore suffered the deaths and the casualties, right? Yes. Is he going to be able to do that again? Okay, so these are some of the key questions I think that are going to emerge, right? Is this a question of U.S. imperialist overstretch rather, right? I don't know, right? The problem for us is obviously, we can talk about this analytically, right? Okay, what are the limits of U.S. imperialism? Is there going to be the law of unintended consequences, right? Is this going to, shall we say, fly back in the face of U.S. imperialism? But the sad part is, while all this is going on, people's lives are being destroyed. People are being killed. There's at least 40 people who died in this incursion to seize Maduro, right, and all of these various attacks. They even bombed the mausoleum where Chavez's body is buried, right? It's a museum, right? It's a mausoleum. It's where people go to visit. It's not a military target. They bombed it, obviously to destroy any sort of cultural memory, right? Okay, and symbols of socialism and revolution, okay? But more importantly, they killed a janitor who was working there. Okay, so this is the fear I have, that we may be able, I don't know, stop this imperial, behemoth, right? But it's going to cost tremendous amounts of lives.
And that's the bottom line. And the fear, I think, Brother Akka spoke earlier about the fear, which is real among leaders also, because in the Caribbean, we have in Jamaica, CARICOM, we're hearing discussions of pragmatism. And I think you've asked, was it your article where you also raised the point of where does pragmatism end and sovereignty begins? Yeah.
Where does it begin? And, and if they build, there's Kissinger who said the U.S. doesn't have friends, it has interests, right? It has tools, right? Okay? And once you no longer serve U.S. interests, you're tossed aside. Okay, and so I mean they're trying to find some sort of way to live with U.S. imperialism, but the U.S. imperialism, particularly in this iteration under Trump, requires utter and complete subordination, right? And so on. And actually, what's interesting, I'm speaking to you from Canada, right? Okay,
yes.
Okay, on the right next door to the United States. And one of the things that happens is that if Canadians are worried if he could do that, these resources, Canada sits on the fourth largest proven oil reserves, much less the largest freshwater reserves in the world, right? Okay, plus a whole series of resources, and he's already begun to use the same argument, like he declared, in 2020, that's when he declared that Maduro was a narco-terrorist. Then he declared, in 2025 that fentanyl was a weapon of mass destruction, right? Okay, and so on, right? Even though we know no fentanyl comes to the United States from Venezuela and from so forth and so on. And he's also declared Canada to be a significant source of fentanyl, while very little fentanyl comes in to the United States from Canada. So it's creating the pretext, and even Canadians here are worried, right? And this is a colonial settler state, right? Dispossessed and exterminated a significant portion of the indigenous population. It has a history of slavery, which people may be surprised at, right? Okay, it's committed to the settler colonial project and to the imperial project the United States has embarked on, and to white supremacy and all of these different things we can say. But even this state now begins to wonder if it's under threat and so forth. So there's all of this insecurity and fear, even among the leadership here, I think, right, of where this is going, much less when we think of the Caribbean islands, right? So that's why I hope that, in a sense, this will lead to people realizing we need to have some Caribbean unity, right? And in a sense, we need to understand that we need to pry ourselves off from the United States to develop our own independent relationships with other parts of the world. I know there was a lot of talk, for the last few years of the BRICS, right? Of the rise of a new geopolitical and economic poles of power, right? And the U.S. is determined not to allow that to happen, right? And it's determined to use what it has in terms of overwhelming superiority over the rest of the world, which is its military might and so forth. So it's a really frightening time.
It is, yeah.
It's a really frightening time. And the fact that, they were blowing up these boats and violating international law, that is tearing up the U.S. Constitution, demonstrates how dangerous things are.
And as you talk about BRICS, just before we go into the break, let me wrap up because the break is a bit long. So I'll continue with the discussion and wrap with you before I take that break. But one of the things I think that you've also talked about, it includes the global negotiations, example with China, and talk about you've written about the fragmentation and how this will make it harder for the Caribbean. I think you're posing the question to negotiate collectively with external powers like China. So let's bring into the discussion the question of China and Russia and Iran and the significance of while the strike on Venezuela was happening, it is quite likely that a high-level diplomat from China was meeting with Maduro or had met with Maduro earlier in the day.
Yeah, some people were saying this was a direct message to China, right? Okay, I mean, think of it. Mistakes happen in war all the time. Incompetence, they could have killed them, right? I mean, there was a time when they hit the Chinese embassy when they were bombing Serbia at one point, right? Yes. During that war. So it was a direct message to China, right? And in fact, it's interesting, and people are arguing. There's a whole debate like Trump's national security strategy. I mean, every government, every administration releases a national security strategy, right? And normally it's only very few people who read it, who are specialists. His strategy that was released, right? Okay, with the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, that is probably the most perused national security strategy of all, right? Okay, and in it, many people were discussing, well, this is an America's first thing, right? Okay, he's going to focus on the Americas, and it's basically, decided that he believes in a world of spheres of tripolar, right? There are other people who say, well, no, before they further retrench their global dominance, right? They have to retrench their backyard and so forth, right? So we have all of these different things going on. But but what's interesting is, as they were talking about America first, he was sending, one of the largest, I think, may have been the largest shipment of military weapons, right, to Taiwan. Okay, was sent there, and that precipitated the Chinese military exercises and so forth, right? So the issue is this: I think what this really is about is that the U.S. They need these resources, right? Okay, you have people like Musk and so forth, and you have the AI, right? There's a lot of people, what they call the Silicon Brothers, or the Silicon Bros, as they like to call them, right? Who are driving AI. It requires a tremendous amount of energy, i.e., you need all of this petroleum, okay, and you need all of these resources like lithium and a whole number of other different things. And that a lot of that is not located. I mean, yes, you have Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves, right? But you also they don't have the lithium. You have it in Africa, right? Okay, and so and the U.S. is a global empire that with investments entangled everywhere, right? So the fact that they can just simply retreat into the Americas, right? Okay, when it's an octopus all over the world, I think might be wishful thinking. And so, in a sense, it's a clear message to China, right? And it's important. It's one point to make here that it was under Obama that in the national security strategy that they officially advocated a pivot to Asia, right? Where they officially acknowledged that China was the major challenge to U.S. imperial power, right? And then under Biden, it was Blinken, who was Secretary of State, who declared Latin America as a front line of struggle against China, right? So there is a uniqueness to the Trump strategy, if we may use the word strategy, but there's also continuity as well in terms of U.S. imperial aggression, right, and so forth, and the imperialist interest and so forth. So, I mean, in fact, there were people both in the first Trump regime term and then in the Biden regime term who spoke about, a coming war with China, right? That it was inevitably going to be a conflict with China, right? And those of us who study the history of economics and between rivals and so forth, particularly in capitalism, right? These conflicts are inevitable. It's inevitable in a system based on private profit and based on the nation state. These conflicts, whatever people may intend, are inevitable, right? Like Trump may have actually believed, and sincerely, I'm not in his mind, okay? Because he said we're not going to get involved in foreign wars. We're not going to get involved in these entanglements. He said that, right? That was his mantra, and that was very attractive for his MAGA base, so to speak, right? What they wanted to focus on was the restructuring of the United States in a white supremacist way, to go back to what it was like, right, before people had civil rights and so on, right? Okay, but they also were against the foreign interventions because they saw that as not focused on the United States and also a drain on money, right? And Trump may have actually been sincere about that, but the actual logic and structure of U.S. imperialism requires these aggressions, right? Requires this expansion, right? And so he, in a sense, is a reflection of the structural contradictions of U.S. imperialism as it economically declines. Okay, I mean, it's when you look at the share of how its share of the world economy and some other important economic factors, right, measurements and dimensions have declined, right, in the last quarter of a century, last 30, 40 years. It's quite striking and so forth. And so, in a sense, I think if we're going to end the danger of war, we need to abolish imperialism. We need to have different economic and political and social systems established in the world, okay, in which people are placed first and the interests of capital are not placed secondary, if not at all, right?
If we go back to, if we look at, you mentioned the national security strategy that was published recently, and we heard Trump in the press conference. He talks about the Monroe Doctrine, and he says, now I hear people calling it the Monroe Doctrine, but I don't know about that. So this is where we are, and if it is to be taken seriously, then what does that mean for Sino-Caribbean relations or Sino-Latin American relations, if you will? Because this, I think, is a question to be asked and answered.
Well, perhaps, now, one of the things that's interesting, perhaps, we think, Cuba might be a good example for that. So when the United States intervened, right, in what the Cubans call the necessary war of independence, during the War of Independence in the 1890s, right? And the U.S. intervened just as the Cubans were on the verge of victory and converted the island to a neo-colony. They imposed something called the Platt Amendment in the Cuban Constitution. So the U.S. occupied the island, told the Cubans that, we will not leave the island, so it actually had a gun to their head if you didn't accept this amendment into your constitution, named after Senator Oliver Platt. And the amendment allowed the United States to intervene in Cuba anytime it wished, right? And it also basically, and there are a number of things within it, right? It also basically said Cuba could not negotiate any sort of treaty with any other country unless the United States approved it, right? And Cuba actually at one point negotiated a treaty with Britain. There's actually a very good book written on this by a Cuban historian. Negotiated a treaty with Britain, right? Okay, and the U.S. stepped in and completely negated it, right? So the idea is that, in the sense that I don't think any of these nations, if Trump does succeed in imposing his hegemonic will, right? Okay, none of these nations will be allowed to negotiate any treaty with any other entity, okay, unless the U.S. approves it. Okay, and if the U.S. doesn't approve it, you'll face all sorts of sanctions and so forth.
So much has been invested already, though. So much has been invested.
Well, that's the issue, right? Okay. Will they just seize it, right? Will they just seize them, right? Yeah.
I'd like to hear what Jamaica in particular has to say about this, because Jamaica has a really close relationship, investment, economic relationship with China in particular. We have just about 2 minutes to go, Professor. So let me say, lessons to be learned. And you've been doing that throughout the program. But as I asked Brother Akko, where do we go from here? KSR community.
I think we've won in the Caribbean. We have to revive the Caribbean dream. And really do the education among particularly young people, because obviously the future why pan-Caribbeanism is necessary, right? In a dangerous world, we have to basically organize among. I think it's going to come from the people. We have to actually democratize our societies in terms of including mass participation of the people, right? So one of the things, obviously, is that when I talk with friends, is that in the 80s and so forth, and 70s and 80s, before the overthrow of the Grenadian Revolution, right, which happened in 83, there were progressive movements, right? There was a discourse, right? So I think the first step is to return to that discourse. I mean, obviously things are different in 2025, right? People have different interests, different preoccupations, but why Caribbean unity is necessary and why we need to have greater participation, democratic participation of people in setting the course of their countries and so on. And I know that's a pretty vague answer, but I think that's where we have to begin. It has to come from the people. Yes. It has to be rooted in the people, and it has to be rooted in our unity.
Thank you so much, Professor Isaac Seni. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much as well. Thank you for having me, and I wish you all the best. And I'm thinking of Jamaica, especially in the wake of the destruction of Hurricane Melissa, right?
Yes, we're rebuilding. Thank you so much, my brother. Look forward to talking to you soon. I'm sure we'll talk again soon, because this thing is fluid, even as we speak. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
So so we just heard from Professor Isaac Seni, and just to remind you of who the professor is, we did that at the beginning, but we didn't do it in between. So if you caught us in the middle of the conversation, you probably did get that. So he is a Black Studies and a Cuba specialist and coordinator of the Black and African Diaspora Studies program at Dalhousie University. He holds a PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London. His teaching, research and scholarship encompasses Cuba, Africa, the Caribbean, Black Canadian history, the global Black liberation struggle and reparations. His major area of research is Cuba's relationship with Africa. So much to talk to Professor Seni about later on. He was also the director of Dalhousie University's Transition Year Program, the groundbreaking program founded in 1970 to redress the educational barriers and injustices that confronted the Mi'kmaq Nation, other indigenous peoples in Canada, and the African Nova Scotia community. He's a longtime community activist and participant in the anti-war movement and the anti-racist struggle, and passionately believes in the collective power of the people to transform the world in ways that bring forth equality and human dignity. All right.